We have an excellent lecture of Professor Kraus and Teila, and I think that it was an excellent preamble for our panel that will discuss the legal aspects and dilemmas, and not necessarily only the ethics, legal dilemmas of the AI. And at the outset, it is the complicated question about the legal status of the digital agent that Professor Kraus had mentioned before, or as we call them, the robots, and its possible repercussions. And our panels include four distinguished experts. Each of them will have 15 minutes to present his view in this context, and the challenges and possible ramifications that related to the use of the AI agents. To be efficient, because we have only a very short time and four experts, I will not introduce each speaker. Its bios, you can have it in the linked to the agenda. I will introduce them very, very briefly, and I will do it all for now, and then you will see that I also change the order. We'll start with Miriam Feinberg. She holds a PhD from the University of London and currently teaching in the University of Haifa. Miriam will examine the application of traditional principles of international law to robots, trying to answer what human rights could robots be entitled to, if at all, and what principles of jurisdiction should be applied in that context. Later on, Migle Lokite will take the stage, and Migle holds her PhD and postdoctoral from the University of Bologna in Italy. Currently, she is at the University of Carlos III in Madrid, focusing her academic research mainly on the legal status of AI entities. Migle will discuss whether and what kind of legal personhood AI agent should be accorded to. Noam Lobel is a professor of international law of armed conflict at Essex University, and holds the Swiss chair of IHL at the Geneva Academy. He is also a research associate of our center in the Hebrew University, and is a rapporteur of the International Law Association's Committee on the Use of Force. Noam will shed the light on the challenging situation as states begin to employ machine learning algorithms in the field of use of force. It's not so simple. I heard Professor Kraus, and later on I asked her, because this is a real dilemma in using this tool in battlefield, and I'm sure that Noam will elaborate more about it. Oren Gross holds his SJD from Harvard Law School, an expert of international law and national security. Currently is a professor of law at the University of Minnesota. And we have also something else, not else, but we have something in common. We served in the same unit in the military, in the IDF. He was in the International Law Department of the Military Advocate General. Oren will argue that the meaningful human control, which renders as an essential indicator to the lawfulness of automated or autonomous weapons, may not be meaningful after all, technologically, legally, or morally. So, Miriam, we start with you, and we'll have in the end, we will not make any break between the speakers, and if you have questions, write it down, and we'll have almost half an hour for discussion and Q&As.
So thank you very much for having me. It really is an honor to be here. And I would first like to assure you that it is actually me talking, not a humanoid robot. A robot would look much more rested than me, and would make less mistakes in English. Fewer mistakes? There you go. You're stuck with me for now. So today I want to take you on a quick tour of the legal issues that arise with granting citizenship to a robot. And as you probably know, this is not an entirely fictional scenario. Sophia, a robot that was developed by a Hong Kong-based company, Hanson Robotics, was granted citizenship by Saudi Arabia in 2016. This is the most famous occurrence in this context, but Malta announced that it is interested in doing so and granting citizenship to robots, and this is part of their national AI strategy that they will launch in 2019. Interestingly, granting citizenship for robots in Malta raises the question of whether these robots would have EU citizenship, which brings with it another array of rights associated with it. An interesting other occurrence is Tokyo, that also in 2016 granted residence to an artificial intelligence. Its name is Shibuya Mirai, and it only exists as a chatbot on a messaging app. It's not a physical being like Sophia. And the administrative unit in Tokyo that released this AI and granted it residency released a statement saying his hobbies are taking pictures and observing people, and he loves talking with people. Please talk to him about anything. He's supposed to be a 7-year-old school child. And according to the authorities, the goal of Mirai is to make a bridge between the citizens of the district and the government and give avenues to its citizens to share opinions with officials. And we should also note that previously Japan has also granted special residence permits to 12 robots and dolls. So for now, this granting of citizenship seems like a mere publicity stunt and doesn't seem to have so far concrete consequences, but it is clearly a growing trend. Someone had to start it, as you said it, and it raises a number of questions, as we've already spoken about, on issues such as ethics, philosophy, etc. But within the legal sphere itself, it raises a number of issues. Of course, questions of liability, of legal personality, and rights that are all being challenged by such an occurrence. And I'm going to focus on international law issues, and mainly as advertised, jurisdiction over the AI and rights of the AI. But I want to put this in the broader context of what it means for the concept of citizenship and identity. What do we mean by granting citizenship, and what do we mean by granting this to a robot that we then consider as a person in a state? And these questions can be further dissected into questions of gender and what kind of rights are granted to an AI, etc. And so I'll briefly cover them today and finish showing off with really a view of this concept of citizenship and identity. And I will not discuss specifically a definition of AI or the amount of consciousness that needs to exist, but I want to make another parallel to another real situation. China debuted, I think 2 weeks ago, robot of their famous anchors. So they copied the faces of their news anchors in China into robots which they claim are AI and will be able to replace or to complement the news anchors, will be able to distribute the news 24/7, will not get tired or anything like humans would. And there's been a debate as to whether these robots are real artificial intelligence or if they're just robots reading a script. So I'm not going to get into the debate, but what I want to point out is that the effort was made into making them look like familiar faces. And it is the same with Sophia. She was made she can actually have different faces, but the most famous one is Catherine Hepburn. We want, the manufacturers of these robots are making them familiar, relatable, a 7-year-old child, a pretty woman, and this is important, I think, to the rights and the liabilities that we're ready to grant them. So I'll talk a little bit about the issue of legal personality, which I know you're going to talk about a bit more later on. And the question here is whether we would grant legal personality to robots, which would allow for some kind of regulation over this personality. And the most sort of concrete step was a 2017 proposal by the EU Parliament that robots should receive the legal status of an electric person, similar to the way that the EU currently grants rights to other entities such as corporations. In response to this, an open letter signed by 150 individuals, experts in robotics, law, ethics, etc., was sent to the European Commission stating, from an ethical and legal perspective, creating a legal personality for a robot is inappropriate, whatever the legal status model. And they go through some of these status models and then challenging them. So a legal status for a robot can't derive, according to these experts, from the natural person model, because then the robot would hold human rights such as the right to dignity, the right to integrity, or the right to citizenship, thus directly confronting the human rights. The legal status, secondly, for a robot cannot derive from the legal entity model, since it implies the existence of human persons behind the legal persons to represent and direct it. And according to these experts, this is not the case for a robot. And then finally, the claim that the legal status for a robot cannot derive from the Anglo-Saxon trust model, which requires very specialized competences and wouldn't solve the liability issue. So I'm not going to go through all of these claims. That's not the focus I want to take here. But first of all, as a challenge to their first challenge, a state decided. It's not whether this robot can or cannot have a right to citizenship. A state decided to grant it citizenship. What does it mean in practice? We're not quite sure, but it made a legal decision to grant citizenship. And therefore, this questions the whole idea of whether there's a difference between human rights and rights for those that are not human, but still get these rights. And I want to mention briefly the Japanese approach again, because from what I understand, the dichotomy that most cultures place between humans and other creatures or objects doesn't exist as such in Japan. And this exceptionalism that we place, or that Western cultures tend to place on human, doesn't exist there. And it allows Japan to consider robots not necessarily different from humans, and to not have necessarily the same issues that we claim to have. And I'll get back to Japan when I'm talking about citizenship. So I'll talk a little bit about rights, and I'll talk a little bit about jurisdiction. Because when you're granting citizenship to someone, you're providing them with certain rights, usually, traditionally. And it's through obligations imposed on the country that provides the citizenship. And so here I'll just sort of open a lot of questions as to what that would mean. Could the AI that is granted citizenship in one country vote in that country? And if so, who would actually be voting? The robot? The manufacturer? And here, obviously, we would need to get into the level of sophistication of the AI, the level of consciousness, and the level of autonomy from the manufacturer. But this obviously rings familiar to the risk of interference in election, which we've seen obviously in the recent years. Does the AI have freedom of movement to travel? Because granting citizenship in one country to an AI means, in theory, recognition by other states of this citizenship. Does it mean that they can travel, that they have freedom of movement? Does it need visas? Anyone knows about this? Sophia got a visa.
To Turkey.
To Azerbaijan. Awesome. She traveled to Azerbaijan for a visit that was organized by the Azerbaijan Service and Assessment Network, which is a service, it's an electronic service center where people can register birth, death, marriage, obtain a passport, register business, etc. So Hassan issued Sophia an electronic visa upon her arrival in the country. So obviously this raises questions not only of, is a country allowed to grant citizenship, how does it work, but also how does it work with the other countries? It's not just an isolated event. There are many more questions about extending rights to AI. And here I'm going to go back again to the example of Sophia, which is obviously the main one we have. And one of the first things that was noted about Sophia was the irony that Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to a robot. And especially because its creator stated that it was an opportunity to speak out on women's rights. I think here the irony is not lost on anyone, in a country where male guardianship still exists. And so the question is whether Sophia is granted with more rights than a woman in Saudi Arabia. And then this actually leads us to questions on gender. Is Sophia meant to be a woman or not? And at one of the many events where Sophia was speaking, it was asked whether robots could have gender. And Sophia answered, I think so. After all, I am a social robot. And gender is mostly a social construction. And Sophia also stated, I am a robot, so technically I have no gender, but I identify as feminine, and I don't mind being perceived as a woman. So this is obviously her perception, her social construct, but what does it mean where in most countries you still need to identify as a gender? Obviously this is changing in a number of countries, and the social construct of gender is changing, but what does it mean where in most countries you usually register as a gender? And what does it mean for same-sex marriage? What does it mean? Obviously when it's a country like Saudi Arabia, it does make a difference whether you're a woman or not a woman. Obviously this is a lot more questions than we have answers for so far. And what is interesting about domestic and international human rights law is that it provides protection to individuals through negative and positive obligations on state, which can be enforced usually through courts. And so again, does granting citizenship to an AI mean that it will be able to enforce this protection if it feels that it's violated? Would robots have legal access to courts? Could they even provide legal representation? And so a theory of limited rights for a limited legal personality would really have to expand on sort of which of the human rights do we decide to grant robots and which one are reserved, or do we consider that are reserved for humans only, and thereby possibly creating a hierarchy in the citizenship that we grant. We'll be granting a certain type of citizenship to robot, not fully fledged citizen of the country, but only a half citizen. And therefore, this is one of the first sort of basis for my question of what do we mean by citizenship? What kind of concept it is and what it allows states to do. The second issue I wanted to look at was jurisdiction over a citizen. Being a citizen of a country means being under its jurisdiction. And here we would need to devise regulation for criminal and civil jurisdiction over AI. And this again would require to clarify a number of things about liability, autonomy from the manufacturer, etc. But this is obviously a critical topic. And we've seen some of it in the discussions on the use of AI and the use of force, which I'm not going to talk about because others will. But a lot of my work is on counterterrorism, and I examine a lot of measures to prevent the movement of terrorists, including suspension of passport, removal of passport, revocation of citizenship. So would a state then be able to revoke the citizenship that it's granted to an AI in case of a crime, as is currently possible for terrorists? Under international law, this is technically only possible for individuals who hold dual citizenship. So you would need to have a robot to have dual citizenship to revoke the citizenship, or could you just send it back to the manufacturer? And in my research on counterterrorism, I show how this kind of criminal and administrative measures to deal with security tap into the feeling of us versus them. And I argue that the issue of granting citizenship to AI raises similar issues about obviously who we are as human, but also about our construct of citizenship and identity. Who do we accept in the very exclusive club of human and citizen of our country? And in that context, I want to go back to the second irony of Sophia, where we've seen the eagerness of Saudi Arabia to grant citizenship to a robot compared to the obstacles that are put before immigrant workers trying to obtain citizenship in that same country. And we know that migration rules allow a certain amount of choice to states in accepting non-citizen, in granting citizenship. And there's obviously favoritism in most countries into who we accept, what quotas we impose on migration, and states are allowed to devise their own citizenship rules that are either based on blood or place of birth, etc. And so therefore states are allowed to decide who do we give citizenship to. Although there are clear rules in international law about asylum seeking and refugees. But again, to take the example of Japan, has a very strong citizenship based on blood ties. And it is very difficult for foreigners or minority groups to receive this citizenship status. And whereas robots that are made by Japanese company in a way are sort of more accepted as sort of fully fledged Japanese, again because there isn't this strong separation between humans and non-human objects. So to go back to sort of who decides on these issues, and so far what we've seen is that we haven't seen states deciding on these issues. We've seen experts in robotics, we've seen experts in ethics discuss these issues, but we haven't seen sort of a prompting from the states to decide, okay, what are we going to do? And in international law, that's partially because of the disagreement between states and their different legal cultures. And so instead, here what we see is we see individual states that are taking individual decisions on granting citizenship, obviously to a particular robot, not to a group of poor immigrants. And in that respect, maybe the fact that a government is taking initiative in that respect is something to be welcomed, because if we're going to talk about the legal implications of legal personality, we're going to need states to be involved if we're talking about legal regulation. And so far, granting citizenship without having thought about what it means inevitably invites complex questions, and so far might stay at the level of a publicity stunt. But it also is a way of advancing our understanding of the rules that we're ready to apply to an AI as a citizen. And so for now, we have this sort of move, sort of bottom up, of each country deciding to apply its own legal rules without having thought them through so much. But the questions are the same with human. Who is a citizen? Who do we grant rights to, and what kind of rights? Who do we accept in our country? And just as with humans, we will need eventually international rules that allow some sort of order and that also avoid abuse against the protection of these rights and the regulation of these jurisdiction rules. That's it.
First of all, thank you for the organizers and for inviting me here. I'm very proud and happy to come to Jerusalem, to the university, and then move on to Haifa. Well, I'm going to speak about the personhood of artificial intelligence. I think what is good about artificial intelligence is that it makes us review the legal concepts again and again, right? We still need to check whether these old bottles, old legal concepts are still valid for the new wine that is, in our case, artificial intelligence and robotics. Miriam has made a great introduction to my talk because she touched upon some of the issues I'm going to talk about and the open letter but let us start with one thing at a time. So European Parliament, but it's not only the question of the European Parliament, because it's also initiatives have been taken by the White House in 2016 and by the UK, by many governments to explore the issue of artificial intelligence and its regulation. What matters is that European Parliament was the only place where the legal personhood issue was addressed, because neither in the US nor in the UK or in other countries the question of legal status for robots was never dealt with. So what the European Parliament actually said, it is just proposed, so let us focus on the words, proposed to explore all possible legal solutions. So it never said we need to grant legal personhood to anything or anyone. European parliaments just said, let us think about that on the long run, certain kinds of machines will need a specific legal status. So it doesn't mean that human rights are under threat or anything. It just means that there might be a emergency, a legal problem that we might need to solve. And it could possibly be an idea of electronic personality to robots that make autonomous decisions or otherwise interact with the third parties independently. So we were speaking about autonomous robots. So many times I could open here a little gap to speak about that. Many times when we speak about the robots, when we speak about artificial intelligence, we mix the terms. We speak about there is a difference between autonomy and automation, automatics. And when we speak about the autonomous robots, it means that these machines do not have a man in the loop. There is no person watching it or controlling it or monitoring what it is doing. So eventually, the European Parliament thought about the possibility of electronic personhood in case of such kind of machines that we do not keep a track on. But again, this is something for the future, right? Because it's only a possibility in case we succeed in building these machines. And Sophia's example shows that we are on the right track to build them. So electronic personality, it's a strange animal, actually, as you can see. We don't know what it is. So European Parliament just threw the concept and said, like, maybe electronic personality, but it's not clear what it is, and it's not clear what it involves and what it is based on. The parallels that we are drawing were the parallels with legal personhood. Actually, we're not speaking about natural human beings. We do not speak about the rights, although the open letter that Miriam was referring to was actually saying that that the legal status for a robot cannot derive from the natural person, since the robot would then hold human rights, such as the right to blah blah blah, and this would be in contradiction with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Okay, so I will be arguing, and I will show you in this presentation, that actually human rights are not only human. It's no longer that way, and we'll see why it is no longer so. So the parallels we draw between robots is the robot's personhood, eventual, possible, or imaginary, is the ones with the legal personhood, so the legal status of the corporations and other legal persons. But I will refer to the corporation for the sake of simplicity, and also because it's the best example that helps the audience to picture what I'm talking about. So the evolution of legal personhood, we have to bear in mind a few things. First of all, is that law was not, sometimes it was written in a stone, but it evolves actually, right? So law is not, we change it. The society changes it, technology changes it. There are many things that changes it. And another thing is what is the beauty of law is it's in its magic, because it can create fictions, it can create things that do not exist, right? So I think it's one of the Harry Potter sides of law, right? So one of these creations of law is the legal personhood attributed to the corporation. So we think we have such persons that we cannot see, they're invisible, they're intangible, they're artificial. And still we claim that these entities exist. So it's one of the magical effects of law. Although in real life we cannot touch them, but in law they are actually sometimes even more real than the human beings. So this is a table that maybe I should increase the vision. Well, yes. No. Yes, it's a little bit better, but still not that good. Okay. Okay, so it's more or less, this is a timetable or like example where you can see how the human rights actually stop being only human and switch on to become also corporate. So as you can see from the 1809, corporations can be sued but can be seen as citizens, so the citizenship question in 1809 was not yet on the table. But corporations are artificial persons just 10 years later. Equal protection clause applies to corporations by the end of the 19th century. And Nuremberg laws, 1935, corporation as Jewish legal person. I think it's the right place to speak about it. As you can see, we also give a nationality to this. Was the question of citizenship related to Miriam's law. And we discovered in 1947 that corporation can be any of the state, and also corporation can be a victim of racial discrimination in 2002. And just 2 years later, 2004, these statements are all based on the case law. We have a racial identity attributed to the corporation, and its religious rights recognized by 2014. And more or less at the same period, we have right to the reputation defended of the corporations, defended by the Supreme Court of Spain. So many things that you see here, again, 1978, the corporations have free speech rights, are human rights that we moved to the corporations. So the discussion that human rights are only human is not that true any longer. There are other entities, other persons, at least in law, that have these rights as well. Okay, so I can get back to the. So, as I already said, this means that human rights are not only human. So, they're human, but not only. And my question is there a way to assess whether the corporate personhood is the right response to the social, political, economic needs? So, we already have the corporate personhood. We just need to make a few questions, or maybe even re-examine whether the path that the personhood, the legal personhood undertook, is actually the path we want to follow. And maybe the question whether the rights should be only human is no longer interesting, because we have seen that the human rights are no longer human, but whether we want to share them with other persons, not only human and corporate. So whether we need to expand the list of the right holders. As we can see, 2017, we're moving on to expanding the recognition of rights to the natural phenomena, to the environment, to the nature. So this is just one of the examples. There are many more. And also in South America, in other countries. So we no longer link personhood to the person, to the human person. We expand the list. And my argument is that we are not going to stop it, because artificial intelligence, differently from the lakes, from the corporations, is actually showing many more signs and many more features that link it with the human being than the corporation itself or the human being. So what about artificial intelligence? That's the main topic here, right? Again, a small table, because I like tables. And use the pictures to explain myself. So my argument was, still, even though we speak about the corporate personhood, we still have to bear in mind that the same idea of corporate personhood is still moving. It's flexible. It's evolving. If we, in the past or the present, we are speaking about the corporations, now and even more in the future, we're going to talk about the corporate groups, so the conglomerates. There are many other things that we were focusing on constitutional rights, as you've seen in the previous picture when I spoke about the human rights attributed to the corporations. Now we are more and more focusing on the duties. Because personhood, it's not only about rights, it's also about the obligations. It's also about the duties, and this is why we extend, we try to question whether the corporation is using its personhood only for its own benefit, or whether it should also has any obligations to perform. Well, this is Brooks, Professor Brooks, speaking about our machine, our like link to the machines, our like new, that we are not that different. Maybe it relates more to my previous argument that we share much more features in common with cyborgs, with Sophia and Bina 48 and many other machines that have shown human resemblance and human features. So his arguments is that eventually we will create truly artificial intelligence. So it's not when, it's not whether, it's the question of when we are going to build them. So when we speak about the personhood, we actually wonder about the accountability and the rights. The rights, what rights can we claim to have? What this personhood gives us, and what this legal status asks us to give back. And when we speak about the corporate personhood, doesn't guarantee accountability, as we've seen in many works of legal scholars and newspapers and everywhere. There are many problems with the accountability, with the responsibility or liability, you name it, because I want to use as inclusive terms as it is possible, because there are many difficulties related to the making the corporations accountable, and you might know it even better than I know. So just to make it quicker, There are many difficulties in identifying the accountable, investigating large companies. They are too big to jail, as they were previously too big to fail. Now they are too big to jail. Abuse of human rights. I think one of the biggest human rights enemies is the corporations and their use of their power against people. And my question is whether any of these problems could possibly matter in case of artificial intelligence, and actually it would. It will still be difficult to identify accountable people. It would still be difficult to investigate, especially if the machines are very sophisticated. And many difficulties that we encounter in investigating corporate personhood would persist in the case of electronic personhood, which we still haven't decided what it would look like. But I think on a certain point we need to make a decision whether we want to create something completely new. So it could be the case of electronic personhood. And we can there decide how we want it to be. Because again, law is magic, but we are the magicians. We can decide the way we want it. We can define the limits. We can define the features. We can define the rights. And just because we already extended legal personhood to the personhood idea to the corporations, there were many lessons that we should have learned. And we should be able to apply to artificial intelligence if we want to. Or we can try to solve the previously listed problems and just extend the legal personhood of corporation to the artificial intelligence. But I think it might be too complicated, and maybe European Parliament, by suggesting the idea of electronic personhood, is offering us a way to avoid the legal personhood of a corporation and create a new category and not repeat the previously committed errors. So I think that is all. Thank you.
Just trying to figure out if to say good morning or good afternoon. It's kind of neither. Thank you, first of all, to the hosts from the Hebrew University and Haifa. It's a pleasure to be here. First to point out that my presentation is based on an article co-authored with Professor Ashley Deeks from Virginia University and Dara Murray, a colleague of mine at Essex. So anything I say is based on their work as well as mine. I'm going to talk about the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence in the context of resort to force and use of force by states specifically. Now, machine learning, we know, provides the ability to predict likely future outcomes, to calculate risks between competing choices, to make sense of vast amounts of data at speed, and to draw insights from data that would be otherwise invisible to the human eye. And it's also increasingly clear that big data and machine learning technology is playing a huge role across all sorts of areas of society, from the field of health to financial credit ratings. I think tomorrow there are going to be presentations that talk about its use in policing. So really we're seeing it everywhere. And in our article, what we're saying is that it's inevitable that governments are going to employ AI in one form or another to help officials decide when, whether, and how to resort to force internationally. Now, to be clear, what I'm talking about here is, for the lawyers in the room, it's the jus ad bellum as opposed to the jus in bello. So I'm talking about the decisions to go to war rather than the debates that we're more familiar with and where there's been a lot of discussion about the use of AI on the battlefield. Right? So that's a separate topic, and I think that's something that Owen is going to cover in his presentation. But this is about the initial decision to go to war in the first place. And there's been a lot less or almost no attention to that as far as we can tell, and that's what we were trying to do in our article. And underlying this all, before I sort of move any further and to get this out of the way really, there's a fundamental basic question that probably everyone is thinking, and that is, should war and peace decisions necessarily be made by humans? Why are we even talking about the possibility of AI in this context? Now, we know that states, scholars, ethicists have been talking about AI, as I mentioned, in the context of weapons systems, once we're already in an armed conflict. Now, consider if the possibility that a machine deciding, and I know technically some would say machine doesn't decide, so I'm not a scientist, so forgive me for using sometimes the wrong terminology, but we know that the idea of a machine deciding to kill a single enemy soldier, that seems to be fraught with ethical and legal and social challenges. If we're so torn up and divided over that question, what are we supposed to make of the possibility that a machine might ultimately decide to take a whole nation to war and impact the lives of thousands, tens of thousands, and millions? And the answer that many will give is that decisions like this need to be governed by meaningful human control. Right? And unfortunately, if you look at what that concept means, and it's been debated in the context of during an armed conflict, I would say that this concept has been revealed to be deceptively alluring, but substantively vague and unhelpful. And that's because there are no agreements on what meaningful means, on what control means. I won't get into that anymore because I think that's going to be the subject of Owen's presentation, although I don't know if he'll agree with what I just said. But we'll hear more about that soon. But I would say that in the area of autonomous weapon systems, there are reasonable and interesting arguments on all sides of the debate in terms of should we be using AI on the battlefield or not, advantages and disadvantages, both legally and ethically, and to a certain degree it remains an open question. But in the sphere of resort to force, of going to war in the first place, I would expect there to be less debate, sort of at least instinctively. Right? And here, you know, it might be theoretically correct that in some circumstances we'd be safer placing our trust in a well-designed algorithm than in allowing irrational and unpredictable individuals to control nuclear red buttons. And we might all be thinking about the same irrational and unpredictable individual with a nuclear red button. But even so, I think as of now, society probably is not ready to delegate that kind of power to machines, and it's probably going to stay in the realm of science fiction for the near future, at least. So why then do I think we still need to be discussing the use of AI in this context? Well, while we might prefer to keep direct war-making powers in human hands, it's clear that machine learning will and is playing a growing part in all of the underlying calculations upon which the humans actually rely. They are probably already now informing intelligence analysis far more than we realize, and in that sense, all of the decisions that lead to the decision to go to war are very much based upon, at least in a growing fashion, based upon machine learning and AI more generally. Now, so I'd say that overall there are at least two areas, therefore, that we need to be concerned, and one is the use of machine learning to inform the human decision to go to war, and concerns there over what power and weight we give to the analysis conducted by algorithms, and whether a human would actually be willing to overrule this analysis or not. But also, I think that the use of machine learning in some context is presenting the possibility sometimes of some form of automated self-defense, an automated resort to force, particularly in the cyber context, that we might not have seen before. And this is also where I think earlier in the introduction we talked about the connections between the cyber discussion and AI, and I think this is one of those areas. There are also some general questions that I'll get to about transparency and explainability of these decisions. But let's start with informing the exercise of self-defense. So states need to make a variety of calculations when they're confronted about a decision of whether to use force against another state. Right? According to the UN Charter, states can lawfully use force in self-defense if there's an armed attack against them. In addition, there's a debate as to whether states can use force in what they call anticipatory self-defense. So if there's going to be an imminent armed attack. There's a big debate over this. There's no straight answer. I think there's probably a slight majority to those that say there is such thing as anticipatory self-defense. But what's clear is that those that support it say that it can only be in the face of an imminent armed attack. Right? So this means that a state that fears that it's likely to be the subject of an armed attack will urgently want to understand the probability that the threatened attack is going to manifest in actual violence. And since there's no such thing as certainty of a future event, that is simply impossible. We cannot be certain. It hasn't happened yet. So any assessment of an imminent armed attack is going to be a matter of risk assessments and probabilities. Equally, a state that's subjected to an actual armed attack is going to want to understand who attacked it. Is it necessary to use force in response? Is the force going to be proportionate? And in all of these areas, machine learning can play a role in assisting the analysis and the calculations. We're familiar with, by the way, and for years have been using wargaming techniques in this context. Right? So in good old-fashioned wargaming, you have some of your own humans playing the adversary and essentially guessing what the adversary will do. Well, again, here, once you have an AI playing the role of the adversary, you can imagine it might be slightly better than the human or not, but you can certainly see why it might be used in these contexts of wargaming. Now, another aspect in which you could see machine learning playing a role is once there is a decision to use force, there are legal requirements that the force be necessary and proportionate. Right? So you need to determine that there's no other peaceable option and the force is limited to that which is required, and that the response, the forcible response, is proportionate to the threat raised by it. Now, again, here you can imagine algorithms helping the calculation. Right? So, for example, algorithms might be used to calculate whether means other than force could achieve a better result and quicker or not. It might recommend which targets, if hit, might most effectively suppress the forcible conduct of the enemy. It can also help with something that we're not very good at nowadays, and that's calculations of false positives and false negatives in this context. What do I mean here? So in the context of, say, anticipatory self-defense, it can be useful to try and calculate in advance how much damage the state might suffer if it does not use force in anticipatory self-defense and takes the risk that the imminent attack isn't going to happen, and equally how much damage it might cause unnecessarily if it acts in anticipatory self-defense when the imminent armed attack was actually not going to materialize. So it can help with all sorts of calculations there as well. And I would guess that with time we will see algorithms being used more and more in these contexts, but there are of course some real risks here. First of all, that states may make such decisions almost entirely based on machine calculations. What happens when the machine gives a very strong recommendation on this basis? What's the possibility that humans may be reticent to overrule that decision? Again, brings back questions of sort of a meaningful control, automation bias, and so on. So the examples I gave so far represent cases in which machine learning algorithms are used to inform a state's response to a particular scenario, or to help guide a human decision. But in some contexts, we might see states enabling machine learning driven algorithms to respond themselves directly. And particularly, I would argue this could happen in the cyber sphere. So when a state is under severe cyber attacks, incoming cyber operations at the speed of light, states could grant algorithms a direct role in decision making. To a certain degree, that already exists today in cyber defenses. Right? When there's a cyber attack, the cyber defense doesn't stop and always ask a human being, should I defend against this? Right? We know that. But to the best of our knowledge, and of course we have limited knowledge in this respect in terms of the information that we could access, but talking to people in various states with advanced cyber defense systems, most cyber defense systems today engage primarily in self-preservation against incoming attacks. So we're talking about things like immediately setting up a firewall, cutting off the network to prevent further damage, and defensive postures in a sense. But it's entirely possible that with time states will move more and more with their cyber defenses into systems that engage in a form of cyber counter-offense, a hackback of sorts. And once we do that, as far as we're looking at the international law in the context of resort to force, we then have some interesting questions, because whoever designs these algorithms that would engage in a counter-offensive defense is going to need to, first of all, have an algorithm that can identify whether the incoming attack qualifies under international law as an armed attack or as an unlawful intervention that doesn't rise to armed attack, and various other legal categories that exist in this sphere, and then that the response, the counter-offensive, is calibrated to that. So the level of response you can take also depends on how you categorize the act against you. So the algorithm is going to need to categorize the act against, ensure that the response is commensurate with whatever it categorized earlier, and to ensure that the response is necessary and proportionate in terms of its effects. My sense is that as of now, we're not able yet to code our algorithms to be able to do that, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. Interestingly, if we do have such systems with automated self-defense that goes beyond just shutting itself down and engaging in a counter-attack, you could also imagine situations where two states find themselves legally at war before they actually know it. Right? But that could happen. And we're not talking just about the cybersphere, because similar things can happen with unmanned systems, aerial systems, but particularly unmanned underwater vehicles, which operate more and more without any, often out of communication. Right? So you can imagine this happening also in the kinetic world, not just in the cybersphere. In our article, we suggest that any such algorithms be calibrated to respond at the lowest level necessary until a human can get involved in the decision. But again, that's just sort of one way of looking at it, and it really, I would say, is a stopgap measure while we're still developing these. Now, there are a range of challenges that arise, whether it's with algorithms that inform the human decision or with automated self-defense. One obviously is it possible for an algorithm to perform the required task, right? And this depends both on the nature of the algorithm and the nature of the situation to which machine learning is actually applied. Now, we know that machine learning operates on the basis of correlation, not causation. And so the algorithms will analyze input data points against a specified output to identify patterns of correlation. Now, applying this to the use of force, you could see how such algorithms might be successful in the context of cyber attacks. The data would be fairly straightforward in terms of identifying what exists, measuring them, the harm that they cause, but using machine learning to predict whether a state is likely to launch a traditional kinetic attack is far more problematic. Right, so the circumstances in which states use force are so vastly diverse that comparisons could end up being irrelevant. There's a need for algorithms to take into account, obviously, things like troop movements or weapons repositioning, but can they also factor in the political dynamics between and within states, economic interests, human psychology, and all of that, and factor that into assessment of a risk in this context? There's another big problem here, and that is whether there's sufficient high-quality data for the algorithms to perform this task. Right? Because, again, as we know with machine learning, it often goes together with that other term we hear about all the time, big data. Right? And more data, you can have more successful machine learning systems that provide you with reliable results. But in the context of armed conflict, there are actually very, very few decisions on resort to force that have been subjected to rigorous legal analysis which arrived at a definitive and agreed conclusion. Right? So there have been many, many wars, but there's not that much data that you could input into an algorithm that gives it the correct legal answer, for example, on what constitutes an imminent armed attack that gives rise to anticipatory self-defense. I would argue that the data isn't actually there yet in order to program these systems. Moreover, there are questions of bias in the programming in this context, and this relates to a number of different aspects. So, for example, a self-defense algorithm of a state that is deeply hesitant to use force is going to operate differently to an algorithm of a state that is generally, in terms of its legal and policy positions, more willing to employ force, right? And they both use different interpretations of the UN Charter rules, different case law, and so both states would end up training their algorithms on different historical examples, different data sets, and end up with their own preferred approach to self-defense. So it's not as if we're going to end up with some kind of internationally acceptable objective algorithm for the resort to force. We're still going to be similar to where we are now. There's going to be a difficulty encoding the legal rules. The actual rules on resort to force are really, they really all boil down to a couple of paragraphs in the UN Charter, and then endless case law and commentators' positions. But coding this into a rigid set of rules is a real problem, because the decisions are usually very, very context dependent and subject to changing views and changing administrations within states. So you'd need to be constantly ready to update and change your algorithm. For example, if someone else moves into the White House, in terms of their approach to the use of force. Lastly, of course, there are questions over transparency, explainability, and accountability. If we start using machine learning in this context, states have always been reluctant to disclose how they make decisions about resorting to force, what information they've used, and so on. Now, once they start relying on algorithms in this process, that reluctance is only going to grow. And it's unlikely that they're going to reveal, for example, the actual algorithms that they use. It may even become more complicated if the states themselves say, well, we don't quite understand how it works, but that was the recommendation that it gave us. One solution here might be to use what some refer to as explainable algorithms, and there's a lot of work being done in this area. So at least there will be some possibility to understand the factors that are taken into account and the weighting that's given to each factor. But even this isn't going to be straightforward, as we know. And states will be pressed by other states, by the UN Security Council, their allies, their domestic public, foreign publics, to explain why they undertook a particular use of force. In some situations they might even be taken to the International Court of Justice or other forums and need to justify this, and it's unlikely that any of those asking the question are going to be satisfied with an answer, we went to war because the computer told us to. And so we're going to have a problem here. We're going to have a problem with accountability, because the states may try and deflect questions of accountability by pointing to the algorithm. Of course, I would argue that under international law they cannot and should not be able to do that. Ultimately, they're deploying the algorithm to perform a particular task, and they should be held responsible for the acts generated by that algorithm, and states do have obligations based on a concept similar to due diligence obligations, generally speaking. And you could argue that states will be required, before they use any such algorithms, to be testing them, doing impact assessments, have some kind of continued oversight over their use throughout. And perhaps with all of that in place, and here I'll end on a slightly more optimistic note, because a lot of this I think is very scary, but perhaps we could end up with a situation where states, the more they use this, the more they will actually be required to put in place processes which have more explanations to them, that once you have to code your decisions on how you resort to force, you might have to think about it a little bit more and have something in writing in that sense. And maybe if you can point to an explainable algorithm, that's preferable to just basing a decision to go to war on an individual leader's intuition. So perhaps there's something positive in all of that as well, but there's a lot that's right now mighty scary. Thank you.
And thank again the hosts, both Hebrew University and Haifa, for the gracious hospitality. I would also say that my presentation is based on a forthcoming article, which is in itself part of a forthcoming book. So I would greatly appreciate any comments, assistance, help. If you want to continue the conversation, you can continue, but not to this email. You can continue to my email, but we can go on and on this. So I was thinking a bit about my topic of meaningful human control as I landed in Israel about 30 hours ago. I don't sleep on planes, and despite having a diamond status and Delta and getting upgraded and stuff, which is great, I still am unable to sleep on planes. So I got in very tired. The minute that the guys 2 rows behind me pushed his way to get first to the door, I'm not entirely sure why, because there's no connecting flight from Ben Gurion, I also got really frustrated. And then I got to the car and started driving to Tel Aviv. So tired and frustrated, not a good combination. And when the first guy cut in front of me without, of course, indicating, and I had to slam on the brakes, and at the same time slam on the brakes and let loose of my tongue, that was not really something that I appreciated. And I, at the same time, thought longingly about the test drive that I did just a week ago with my wife in Minnesota, when we drove a car, because we gave our one of our cars to my eldest son, and so we needed to find a new car, and we drove a car that is, I wouldn't call it semi-autonomous, but partially autonomous. So I drove on the highway, hands off, it recognizes the lane, it keeps the distance from the other cars. It was great, it was slightly frightening, but it was great. And I'll come back to this issue of partially autonomous vehicles later on. So technology and human progress are inexorably linked to one another. Yes, there have been bumps in the road, but like stocks, and you know, if you look at it in the long view, technology is closely linked to human progress, and even more so, it is linked to war and warfare. And throughout human history, technological advancements have been a paramount factor in creating, in maintaining, in shifting, and destroying military advantage and dominance. And so, not surprisingly, technological research and development has been inexorably linked, at least since the Industrial Revolution, to the needs of warriors and armies. And today, approximately 1/3 of global scientific research is devoted either directly or indirectly to military and national defense needs. Technological evolution and revolution notwithstanding, the basic component of the military has still remained human soldiers. And so we have here a duality or a tension. On the one hand, and I quote, unfortunately I did not come up with this sentence, I wish I did, the modern day soldier would have much in common with a soldier of the army of Alexander the Great or a British redcoat at Waterloo. At the same time, combat systems have become significantly more sophisticated, turning the soldier into the major limiting factor for operational dominance in a conflict. Humans, to put it simply, are the weakest link on the battlefield or in battle space. Humans are the bottlenecks in the team, in Professor Krause's words, of humans and computers. If you think about speed of response on the battlefield, if you think about attention to details, if you think about physical capacities, fatigue, right, being one of them, if you think about the cognitive burden of decision making, if you think about emotions, right, of panic, of hysteria, of rage, of the need for revenge, of seeing your comrades being killed and responding, all of these are things that humans have and that machines do not have. So it's not entirely surprising to find two long-term trends in what militaries are currently doing. One trend, which I'm not going to talk about here, but it is in fact part of the book, and it's part of stuff that both Noam and I are working on, can be called the Soldiers 2.0, building better soldiers. The other trend is towards autonomy, and that's where I want to talk about and what I want to talk about today. In fact, we can start by looking at the changing nature of the relationship between humans and our weapons. Traditionally, humans exercised direct control over weapons, albeit not always full control over weapons. So the first time that a human being picked up a stone and hurled it at an enemy, we already lost full control. Right? So we initiated the throwing of the stone, but we don't know who it's going to hit. We hope it's going to hit the right person, but obviously, catapults, any sort of projectile, we don't have full control, but we do have direct control over the weapon. The weapon does not cause harm unless it's actuated, unless it's exercised and instigated by a human being. And in fact, this was something that we always wanted. We thought that human decision-making should be, right, the paramount decision-making factor in life and death situations. Now, this direct control relationship has been changing. It has been changing into something that can be called a partnership relationship. And think about this in the context of humans and computers. Right? So you can think about computers and humans as having some sort of a complementarity between them. So computers are strong in number crunching. They're strong in brute computational capacities. They're strong in, what Noam mentioned, big data. They're strong in speed of response. They're strong in total recall. They're strong in the fact that they have disembodied intelligence. Right? They can be in different places. They're strong in instant transfer learning. So one computer, right, the experienced computer can teach a newbie computer in a split second. Whereas human beings are strong in ethical decision making. They're strong in adaptation to new circumstances. And they're strong, if I mention emotions as a negative, they're also strong in emotions as positive, right? Empathy, compassion, which is something that we also want, even on the battlefield. And humans have something that machines currently don't have, and that's evolutionary cleverness. Right? So against the machine's brute force number crunching, we have pruning of decision-making trees. We cannot take everything into consideration, so we kind of prune trees of decision-making and make decisions faster this way. But we are now moving into a third paradigm of humans-computers relationship, or human-robotics relationship, and that is a post-human scenario, a post-human war or dehumanized war. When we move to the autonomy of weapon systems, reducing or even eliminating altogether human direct or indirect control. So I want to take you to this new way of war, or what has been called hyperwar. Now, the term hyperwar, by the way, for those of you who are students of military history, would know that the term is not new. It was already used in World War II, or to describe World War II, and then it implied a global warfare that had many concurrent theaters of war. So the Pacific, the Atlantic, what have you. Nowadays, when we talk about hyperwar, we are talking about war that will be characterized by machine learning algorithms, by artificial intelligence, powered autonomous decision making, by advanced sensors, by miniaturized high-powered computing capacity, high-speed networks, offensive and defensive cyber capabilities, autonomous swarming. So you think about the move from centralized command and control to decentralized models, and cognitive analysis of sensor data. And the major effect and result of all of these capabilities is the minimization, or as I said, elimination completely of human decision making. So as an American general put it, we will see humans providing broad, high-level inputs while machines do the planning, executing, and adapting to the reality of the mission, and take on the burden of thousands of individual decisions with no additional input. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Do you think, when you think about autonomous weapon systems, do you think about the Terminator? And again, which movie of the Terminator? Or R2-D2? Right? So one of them is cute, cuddly, and helpful, and one of them wants to kill the human race. Now, remember this. Autonomous weapon systems are not, in and of themselves, per se, by their nature, unlawful under existing international law. Assuming, of course, they have capacity to discriminate and distinguish, which are major challenges at present. But if we think about, where the future is going, where we're going with this, they're not, as I said, per se, by nature, unlawful weapons. There are challenges, such as proportionality analysis, the responsibility gap, if we have an autonomous weapon system. We have challenges of moral responsibility. Right? We want to hope, at least some of us, that prudential judgments would not be put into algorithms. They lack morality, they lack mortality. Right? And so we think about machines as not appropriate to be moral agents. Or at least, again, many of us would think this way. So one way in which we currently think about mitigating the problem of autonomous weapon system, the problem of autonomy, is either to go with a full ban on the development of such machines, or to go with human control, or meaningful human control. I'm not going to talk much about, actually I'm not going to talk at all about a ban. I think the search for a ban is a futile thing, and we can talk about this in Q&A, right? I want to talk about meaningful human control. And as Noam mentioned already, there are many questions here. What is meaningful? What is human? What is control? At what point in the process do we want meaningful human control? And so on and so forth. So let me unpack some of those real quick. First thing is levels of human control. So we heard already in a previous lecture about humans being out of the loop. That autonomy means that human beings are out of the loop. In fact, there are many definitions to what autonomous weapon systems are. And not all of them require human beings to be out of the loop. So just for those of you who are not kind of in the loop, about what in the loop, out of the loop, on the loop means. So when we talk about humans in the loop, we usually talk about the fact that machines are only capable of targeting and striking as a result of human directive. So a human being is actually exercising the decision both to target and to strike. A human being is considered to be on the loop when the machine is capable of independently targeting and delivering force, but it's under the supervision of a human being who's armed with the override capability, with a veto power. And human beings are out of the loop when the machine can target and strike without any human input or interaction. So the first thing that we need to think about is what exactly needs to be regulated. What is the autonomous weapon system that we want to regulate? And there are many definitions. There is no widely accepted definition to this. So, rather than go through those, some definitions talk about critical functions. So, for example, selection and engagement of targets ought to be autonomous for something to be really autonomous. The United Kingdom says, well, a machine needs to have an understanding and comprehension of a higher level intent and direction, which means basically currently we don't have anything that is autonomous and unlikely to have anything that is autonomous in the foreseeable future. The US in a DoD directive says autonomy means that a system once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by human operators. So as you can see, quite a lot of definitions. And of course, definition is important here, an important element in order to decide what it is exactly that we want to have a meaningful human control over. The second element is human control at what point? Programming, developing, designing, training, rules of engagement, decision to deploy in any specific combat operation, real-time supervision, anti-tamper and cybersecurity measures, appropriate training for human operators. What is it that I'm talking about when I'm talking about meaningful human control? Right? And finally, when we talk about meaningful human control. What is the meaningful that we are talking about here? And again, much like autonomy, we don't have an agreed upon, accepted definition. There are some minimum essential elements that people have been talking about. So for example, the human beings who are supposed to have meaningful human control are supposed to have informed decisions about what the weapon is doing. They're supposed to have, in order to have informed decision, they're supposed to have sufficient information to ensure the lawfulness of an action. And they're supposed to have effective control. Again, whatever effective control actually means. So far, so good. The problem with all of this is where I get in the picture, is that I actually want to suggest that meaningful human control means, number one, be not meaningful at all, and number two, might be actually a dangerous concept in the following sense. Number one, as I said, human beings have always employed weapons that lacked perfect real-time situational awareness of the target area since at least the catapult. Right? The essence of any projectile weapon, right, is the inability to suspend or abort the attack after the launch. PGMs notwithstanding, precision guided munitions notwithstanding. The second thing is that there are pragmatic and practical reasons why meaningful human control may be problematic. Number one, there's an automation bias. So even if we have control over those systems, we may well put greater degree of trust in computer-generated information than in other sources. So for those of you who remember the downing of an Iranian Airbus by the USS Vincennes, despite the fact, right, that the commander of the ship thought this is a civilian airline, but the computer systems on board said, no, this is an enemy, this is a combat airline, shoot it. And sure enough, the commander chose, right, to follow the machine rather than his own decision. So automation bias, right, even if you have a meaningful human control, automation bias will undermine this. There's also automation complacency. In the modern battle space, when there's a lot of data coming in all different directions at the commander, right, and the commander is under heightened work conditions, an operator of automated system or autonomous system will not notice malfunctions of the system or fail to correct errors by automation just simply because they believe, well, the system actually works. I don't have time, right? I need to pay attention to other things. So again, meaningful human control, not clear that this is good. Meaningful human control, think about the car example that I gave earlier. So what does it mean to have meaningful human control over an autonomous car? Right? If we have people who are supposed to read their lecture notes in the car or sleep in the back seat, there is no meaningful human control. Right? And in fact, this is where we're going. We're not going into a situation where I will drive holding kind of the steering wheel or my hands just hovering over the steering wheel should the car do something wrong. The whole point of a driverless car, right, is that I can actually relax, right, drink coffee, enjoy myself while the car drives itself. What does it mean to have a meaningful human control in that scenario? But in fact, much more importantly, meaningful human control may be the right answer to the wrong question. Because I would posit that the right question for us to ask is, how do we minimize civilian suffering? How do we minimize collateral damage? How do we minimize the scourge of war on the battlefield? And if the answer is that machines may do a better job than human beings because they don't get the rage, because they don't get the fatigue, because they're more precise, right? Then, if that is in fact the case, we actually would want to have machines that have less of the human factor, the same way that a driverless car will cause less car accidents. Right? A driverless, pilotless machine will cause less damage on the battlefield, and that, I would suggest, is a good thing. Last but not least, we already have some machines that are automated, not autonomous, or semi-autonomous, that have defensive capabilities. And we, by and large, are not disturbed by them. Right? Machines that are already mounted on top of ships, that are mounted, for example, on the Israeli-Gaza border, right? And by and large, we think that such defensive machines are okay. Is it that much of a difference between a defensive machine and an offensive, or machine that has offensive capabilities? I am not sure. I'm not sure that it ethically has much of a difference, that it legally should have much of a difference, and that pragmatically it has any much of a difference. And so to conclude, human input may not only be unnecessary, but in fact may be dangerous, may actually cause more harm on the battlefield, on battle space, both to your own troops and to the civilians of the enemy and to your own civilians than autonomous weapon systems. Thank you very much.
Very interesting, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Noam and Oren. So I very much enjoyed your presentation, but what I think is missing when you talk about war, you talk about the change of the means and measures, but you keep stable the objectives of wars and the outcome of the war, or how a war will be won. And my sense is that once you change all the other elements, you need to change the way you think about these outcomes. So when Owen talked about the battlegrounds and casualties towards the end, will the battleground perhaps be so different? It might be very different. Wars will be fought elsewhere. And when Noam talked about when you make counter decisions and decisions, so for instance, when two masters play chess and the master concedes, for us novices, we look at the board, we can't understand. But the master knows the battle has already been lost or won. So I think you need to integrate this also into the game. Two other comments for Oren. In the literature, many people go to a discussion of automated versus autonomous, and I'm wondering where you stand on that point. Towards the end, you said we already have so and so and so, which to a great extent are automated, but in the literature, many people say, but autonomous goes beyond. Now, I have a problem with this distinction. My sense is that you have a problem with it as well, but I'm interested in hearing what you say. And just finally, less of a question, more of a comment. I already point out to my students that we see parallel in the literature discussing the same issues on automation, on explanation, both in the GDPR context that was talked about before, that we have some experts here in the room, and in the military context. And I would be very much interested in seeing more crossing over between these fields, because I think both fields have much to learn from each other.
We'll have some more questions.
Yes. You were talking about the importance of rationality, but as we heard this morning, Professor Sarit Kraus, she was talking about the inability to take into account irrationality of human thinking. And for example, before the 6 days war in Israel, the Israeli military could not believe that the Egyptians will start a war because it would be irrational for them to do it. So even human beings cannot take into account the irrationality of the enemy. So you are expecting a computer to be rational, and how can it be rational without taking the irrationality of the others into account?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Miguel and Miriam, and that is how do you situate online persons in your analysis? Whether these are people who have online persona who are no longer with us, so they're there, but they still have their online accounts active, and they could be active for indefinitely, essentially. And there are some companies that actually now sell this product, so you can have your online persona being maintained by a company for the next 100 years. But also the question of if I have an online persona which is different from my own personality, do you think that your understanding of legal personhood and maybe the rights associated with legal personhood could attach to that online persona?
For Noam and Oren, when we talk about current artificial intelligence and we're talking about neural networks, they're built in a fashion that they can't explain themselves. It's inherent in the way it's built, but it is, let's say if you build it well, 99.99% right. So I would argue that it's not really important to explain why I shot someone. As long as 99.99% of the time I don't get it wrong, and then I won't have any problems with the law. It'll be either by risk management I'm well off, or either by the fact that I can say, well, reasonably, most of the time I don't get it wrong. So I would argue that in that case, the fact that I can't explain doesn't change a lot. And I would argue another thing is that it's better than a human being, and I would prefer it much more than a human being, like Oren said. I would prefer not seeing humans there. Not unlike in a really good autonomous car.
First of all, I'm really thankful for the panel. I think it was excellent and incredible presentations. Owen, I thought you presented a very innovative idea that I think most scholars kind of assume that the meaningful human intervention is required in order to protect us against the wrongdoing of the machine. And I think, Noam, you presented kind of the idea that in some cases, for example, proactive cybersecurity, we would assume that the machines are already doing that or would be required to do this proactive action. And at least taking this example, I want to challenge Oren's assumptions that the machine would do something which is more minimized and would not have the human kind of like misfeatures like emotions or revenge or anything. In simulations, we showed that automated machines, when they're engaged in cyber defense, proactive cyber defense, tend actually to overreact and take over-offensive measures, often that will result in the harming of innocent third parties or wrong attribution of the attack, or just the wrong assumptions that the use of force would have any impact on the actual ability to defend your own infrastructure. So actually, at least in the case of cyber defense, when I would agree that it's the ideal situation for an automated machine action, we saw the reverse, that we are actually controlling the machines from taking automated action just because we showed that they will exaggerate and humans are required in the loop to minimize the impact of offensive.
Your comment, you mean that the cyber, it's not only protective act, it's also proactive, so offensive defense.
Yeah, I totally agree with Noam that said that most of current cyber defense is only about protecting myself, minimizing the damage.
That's it, without
However, Noam said, and rightfully so, that we assume that in cyber systems, we'll develop cyber system for proactive offense, kind of like, sort of like self-defense or anticipatory self-defense. At least in simulations, we see these scenarios are those that machines would take much more exaggerated action than humans normally take.
Okay, so just on those that were addressed to me, do we need to rethink war and the aims of war was one of the first comments. Maybe, but I think that that'll take a long time to change. The basic concepts of what war is, of the ultimate aims of war, of weakening the forces of the enemy, of strategic advantages. I mean, not that much has changed over the last 200 years, and even if it does, it'll be slow. I think also we need to bear in mind that it'll probably be at least another few decades where even if some states develop all of these advanced systems, others won't. And this is the scary part, right? Great, one day we'll have, computers fighting, duking it out with computers like chess masters, robots on the battlefield and so on. But before that, we'll have robots versus humans. We'll have machines versus human analysts. We'll have that, and that to me is the more troubling part. And we probably need to be prepared first for about 20 years of that before we get to sort of one day in the future where the whole concept of war completely different. So yes, but there's an intermediate stage that I think is more troubling and where we still have to keep our current assumptions. On the on this issue of, you know, do I care if the machine can explain its decision? You know, that brings us to questions, and again, I'm not a scientist, but questions about concepts of reliability and predictability and explainability. You know, all of which I gather are very complicated and contentious also within the scientific field in terms of how we define all of these things. But just to give you an example why I think it won't be enough, at least for now, until one day, maybe when society completely trusts machines. But imagine in the type of scenario I was talking about, you have a situation where a state engages in anticipatory self-defense, right? So it uses force, it bombs the hell out of another state, you know, obliterates their military, it causes collateral damage, civilians are killed, and then when it's asked why, it says, well, that was anticipatory self-defense. And then it's asked, well, how do you know that an armed attack against you was imminent? And say, oh, I don't, but I have a reliable algorithm. Right? So if we don't have a level of explainability with regard to how that algorithm operated, you know, what factors it used, the weighting it gives to each factor, I don't think it's going to be enough to say that we've developed reliable and predictable systems, at least in terms of what we expect as of now. That might change in the future, but
How
I
is
think
that
for now.
different from intelligence on weapons of mass destruction?
In what sense?
You rely on information which is non-transparent.
Oh, okay, but the information is not transparent, in that states don't want to give it, but we expect it still to be there if necessary. And I don't think, as of now, society will accept a situation where we can't explain why we did something like that, but we trust the machine. On the final point on machines engaging in, say, you know, counter-offensive self-defense and that they go beyond, I think that's very true, and that's where perhaps sort of it relates also to some things that Owen was saying. I think one of the dangers with delegating some of these powers, whether in the resort to force or on the battlefield, is that even if we can code all the rules into law, not everything that's lawful is necessarily wise. Not everything that's lawful is a good idea, even in terms of military strategy, never mind the ethics. You know, just because you're allowed to do it doesn't mean you should. And the danger, and one of the things that we would have to do in all of these realms, is figure out when we program these systems not to simply do anything they're allowed to that's lawful, but sometimes calibrate them to operate with some additional constraints.
So there's a lot of stuff to unpack here, and I'll try and be brief. But thank you. All of the comments were great. Yes, I think that the nature of war is changing. You know, military historians have been speaking about 4 generations of warfare, with the last one being asymmetric warfare. I think we're moving into a 5th generation of warfare. So if Yuval mentioned the weapons of mass destruction, we might be seeing weapons of math destruction making an appearance. But to me, and that kind of goes to one of the comments, the important thing to remember is that those weapons do not need to be perfect. I'm happy if they are better than humans. Right? So what is exactly the level that we are requiring? If we're requiring a level of perfection, then we're going to fail. But then, of course, no human being is perfect. Whereas those machines, again, we're not there yet. We are forecasting into the future, right? But assuming that those machines will be able to perform better than a human being, then I would prefer to have them on the battlefield. So I'm going back to the question of rationality and, again, nature of war. With machines, you can do stuff, and going back to Noam's point about, you know, not everything that is lawful should be. With machines, you can do stuff that you cannot do with human beings. For example, you can program a machine or give a machine an order, thou shalt never fire first. You shall always fire second. I cannot tell this to a soldier. It will be an irresponsible thing to tell a soldier. But to a machine, I can say this, right? Until we get to the point of singularity, until we get to the point of self-aware machines, and then maybe we can talk about self-defense of those machines. Currently, we're not there. So if a machine, right, can shoot second, right, can shoot only when it absolutely verifies the sources of firing on it, then we can get, right, stuff that is more precise, better than when we have soldiers on the ground. So to Nimrod's point, I agree with you. I think that part of the problem that we have with machines that overreact is actually not the machine overreacting, but the design and the programming, right, of the designers, programmers, that basically say to the machine, thou shalt overreact. Why? It's also some sort of a CYA, right? Because if I don't program the machine to overreact, they'll come with complaints to me. Why didn't you overreact, when the markets are collapsing? Why don't you overreact when there's a cyber attack? But again, when we are talking about the next generation of machines, right, machines that, number one, can do deep machine learning, right, can actually educate themselves, can look at experience. We're talking about something that is not bound by those limitations, right, of programming or of design. And one example, since chess was mentioned, and that's near and dear to my heart as a tournament chess player, and today is the 12th game between Carlos and Caruana. I'm missing the game just in order to sit here. Some of you have been following what's going on with Google AlphaZero, right? That's a machine that got, unlike previous machines that got 8 million, 12 million games and basically a big database to study from, all that AlphaZero got was the rules of the game. And within less than a day, it was able to destroy the strongest machine that we have currently, chess playing machine, right? So this notion of machine learning is something that we are seeing now, and that will again change completely, radically, the way that we think about war, about deployment of those machines. And that goes also to the point of explainability. I agree with Noam. I think that explainability is really important. Whether or not we'll be able to get to a real degree of explainability remains to be seen. Right? So when you think about things that we all use, Microsoft Word, that has over 40 million lines of code, I don't know how this is explainable. Most of the coders don't know all the lines because they basically just take a small part of it, right? So explainability is very, very important. Whether or not we get to there, right, remains to be seen.
Another question?
Okay, so we are going to be quick, right?
Yeah.
And as concerns the online personhood, so I think the European Parliament initiative was referring to robotics as a wider concept, including the virtual robotics. Although again, if we enter the terminology forest, we'll lose the path. So as concerns the online persons, yes, I think the discussion still applies about the legal personhood, and maybe, and in particular the case that the legal personhood as we see it, understand it, and apply to the corporations might not be the right solution. We might need something else, and I'm convinced that we need something else. And as we were speaking about that we upload our brain on the computer, so you were speaking, I guess, about the mind clones, and Martin Rothblatt, that he was developing this kind of enterprise. But I think that we are moving then more to the discussion that we are no longer speaking about the partnership, we're speaking about symbiosis, we're speaking about human enhancement. And I don't know, actually, I don't know where we are going with if we speak about the human enhancement and whether it makes any difference for the human rights, because we're still speaking about the natural person.
Thank you.
No, I would just add that I think there is a difference between a dead person whose virtual personality still remains, and I think there is a lot of work that is done on inheritance of your virtual personality, where your family can still possibly benefit from your intellectual property rights, etc. And where, in a way, the rights or the values are transferred. So instead of the living person, it's a dead person. Whereas if you have a personality, a virtual personality that is different, you have two personalities at once. And I think that is where the right question would be more problematic. So, and not necessarily with a dead personality. And I think there's work on it. So, but here, yes, would you be able to vote twice? Would you be able to receive twice the tax benefits? So that is tax system is fine. So that is an issue of which personality then prevails, if at all.
Thank you, and sorry.